The following video presentation is a summary of the Unit DNI assignment guidance and information for candidates, which can be found at the NEBOSH website. Although not absolutely essential before you start your Unit D assignment, it is strongly recommended that you've already attended and sat through all of your tutorials on Unit A, B and C. Largely due to the support knowledge that you'll have going forwards with respect to safety management systems and their structure and content, the framework of compliance, whether that be in terms of national legislation or indeed in terms of the International Labour Organization conventions. From a Unit B perspective, to have a good cross overview of the various types of health agents that might exist in the workplace, and also in Unit C, the various workplace hazards that you might encounter with respect to your understanding of risk profile. The element which is a non-tutorial element, that is element A11 and in the international syllabus A9, are actually both relevant to this particular assignment. So you may want to check up on the syllabus and get a brief overview of that. Also perhaps go back to your training provider and ask them what sort of support that they're going to have in place for that. Your criterion for passing the assignment is that you need to attain 50% of the marks available. It's marked out of 100, so therefore you need to get 50 marks to pass this particular unit. Your assignment, it is recommended by NEBOSH, should be at least around about 8,000 words. The word count will not include things like your contents list, your bibliography, nor will it include anything that you include in terms of an appendix. Other things which are not included would be any actual quote that you take from an external piece of information, for example a guidance note, and include it in your piece. But bear this in mind, most important, that if you do cut and paste any information from an already published and established source, that unless you put it in quotation marks and reference it in accordance with an appropriate referencing style, you may be accused of plagiarism. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later on in this video. The upper word count, it's not a maximum, you don't get penalised for exceeding it, but NEBOSH would expect you to bring your assignment in by at least 12,000 words. And for the level of content that's required, that will also necessarily avoid any unwanted padding. Your first port of call is most likely to ensure that you are choosing a workplace which is actually going to fit the brief and be suitable for the assignment. In most cases, it will probably be your own workplace that you're familiar with. However, it is important that you think about that and evaluate that fairly critically and ask yourself the question whether or not there is enough complexity within the workplace to be able to offer you a range of Unit B type health hazards and also Unit C type workplace and safety hazards. This is important because a part of your assignment will be an overview and an analysis in terms of your risk profile. The other thing that's important is that the organisation is necessarily, again, complex enough to be able to offer you the elements of a safety management system. It doesn't necessarily have to be an accredited system, it doesn't have to be a formal system, but it does need to have the basic managerial elements for planning your strategies, for organising people and their responsibilities, for maintaining managerial control over your precautions, for the measurement and monitoring of performance actively and reactively, and finally, with respect to the data that you gather from your measuring activities, to have some sort of mechanism in place where you might review what your performance is as it stands with respect to the objectives set at the policy level going forwards. If you do have a very large organisation, however, that may also be quite limiting. It may just simply be too large to manage with respect to the assignment itself. Under those circumstances, it will probably be most appropriate to pick just a single department, perhaps, or a single site for that organisation as a whole. In any case, your first port of call to clear up any uncertainty will be to consult your training provider and the tutor that's allocated to be able to offer you this degree of support through your Unit D assignment. The ultimate nature of the assignment is that you are supposed to be providing a critical analysis and review of how robust your organisation is with respect to how it deals with health and safety issues. This may make unpalatable reading for certain people within the organisation, and it may also raise a few worries as to confidentiality. And for this purpose, it is possible to actually come up with a fictitious name for your organisation, change the names of people that perhaps you've interviewed or people who have got responsibilities allocated to them for that very reason. If you do, there is a specific disclaimer that you should include on your script, on the front page of your report. And that is, the organisation and or officers' names included in this report are fictitious, but the report is based on a real organisation / workplace. With regarding your submission, you have 4 opportunities for each of your registration to submit. There will be a date in February, a date in May, a date in August, and a date in November. For the specific dates, once you've submitted your intent to submit, then you will receive official notification with that date on. Dates can also be cross-checked against the NEBOSH website. Your submission must be in electronic form only, word processed versions only, nothing handwritten or typewritten. The reason for this is, as we will see shortly, is that it will be checked against a national plagiarism database. The submission will go straight to NEBOSH. Do not send it to your training provider. On each page of your assignment, on a header or a footer, you must have your student PIN. And it's most important that nowhere on your assignment does your name or your training provider's name appear. And also, most importantly, should anything go wrong, should your submission be lost, etc., make sure you've kept a secure and backed up copy of your final draft. NEBOSH takes issues of plagiarism very, very seriously. They do not take it lightly at all. Your work must be your own. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that if you do actually take a piece, cut and copy from, let's say, a guidance note and include it in your work, make sure you've clearly indicate that it's a quotation, as it were. It must be referenced using a recognised standard. And whatever you do reference in that way does not count to your overall word count. As I say, NEBOSH takes plagiarism exceptionally seriously, and they subscribe to a national academic plagiarism database called Turnitin. Your script in its entirety will be fed into that database, looking for matches with others, and moreover, your script will then form a part of that database in the future. This should serve as a warning should you consider maybe taking on board what someone has already previously done, or as a future warning for any individual that comes forward inquiring whether or not they might take a look at your report, perhaps with a view to perhaps stealing part of it, to put it bluntly. NEBOSH take this very, very, very seriously. And if you're caught or in any way, shape or form or suspected of plagiarism, they will investigate. And if their findings turn out to be positive, you may be disqualified from the qualification forever. Okay, now we're going to turn our attention to the assignment structure, and we're going to look at each part of this in some level of detail. Now, NEBOSH in their guidance give you the specific structure to follow. My advice to you here is do not deviate from this structure. Your final report should be structured such that the first part of written content, following the title page and your contents page, will be the executive summary, which will be the last piece that you write. Then you'll have as main headers, introduction. Whenever you start any of these main headers, make sure you start it on a new page to give it clarity. The next main part that you're going to look at, which is going to be the main body, the largest piece that you're going to write, will be the review and critical analysis of arrangements for managing health and safety within the organisation. Following on from that, from the specific areas that you think warrant most attention, and without giving anything away here, we're looking for 3 principal priorities that you feel are important to address. More on that as we go through. There is a section there to evaluate those for the improvements that will be required. From this, you will start to draw the assignment to a close by bringing together your main conclusions and recommendations going forwards. Then construct a bibliography, making sure that you use an appropriate citation method. Harvard or Vancouver are strongly recommended by NEBOSH and by myself. And finally, any piece that you feel is actually going to support what you've written. Now, bear in mind, nothing in the appendices will be marked. There is or has been a tendency in the past for students to stuff lots and lots of documents into the appendices. Really and seriously, NEBOSH are not looking for that. All they want is anything which will actually help the examiner understand maybe some parts of your main body. Remember, there are no marks awarded for it. It might make your report look nice and thick, but it adds nothing to your overall mark. Now, these are the main headings. What I've kind of like gone forward to is tease out some of the specific subheadings which will attract marks. So over and above these main headings, consider the following. In your introduction, there are 4 subheadings that you should stick to. Firstly, you need to state your aim and objectives. You need to be able to describe your research and development for the project itself. You need to have provided an adequate but comprehensive workplace description, and you also need to give some consideration to the role of the safety practitioner, yourself, and the kind of like ethics that govern our profession. As far as a review and critical analysis of your arrangements, this is where most of your marks are actually awarded. So you need to be able to, on the basis of the information that you've gathered, be able to critically analyse your leadership, critically analyse management, critically analyse the opportunities for worker involvement, critically analyse your competency profiles, critically analyse your compliance with legislation, standards, conventions, etc. And out of all of these areas, it's your risk profile that will actually attract most of the marks. Again, it will be very much a critical appraisal. Your next main heading is your evaluation of improvements required, and there are 3 specific subheadings that you need to address. Firstly, you need to think about your role as a safety practitioner within that organisation, or what the theoretical role of the safety practitioner should be within that organisation if you don't belong to that organisation, with respect to implementation, the practical issues of making these improvements. How the improvements are actually going to be communicated to everyone within the organisational structure. And also you need to sharpen up on your cost benefit analysis skills, because you would be expected to put in place a convincing financial argument for implementation. So we've got our main headings, and as you can see, for the introduction, for the main body with the review and critical analysis, and with the evaluation of improvements, there are subheadings that we need to go forward. Please stick to this framework. Make sure you include something on each of these articles. These will be marked. The only thing that's not going to be marked here or attract any marks is the appendices. Everything else will, in one way or another. Okay, a more detailed look now at our structure with respect to the executive summary first and foremost. This is ordinarily the last thing that you'll write. It's where you're going to condense everything down into a single page. It needs to be persuasive. The general idea, or the way that NEBOSH describe it, is it should be sharp, short and pithy, for someone that ordinarily wouldn't normally spend time reading an entire document. It should encourage them perhaps that if there's anything of there that appears important, that they might dip in a little bit further and go and look at the detail. Make sure it's factual. Your facts are substantiated, and write it in plain language. Avoid jargon. Certainly don't use any acronyms, etc. But bear in mind, you've got to keep it short, and it needs to be comprehensive. You need to include a summary of your main conclusions and your main recommendations. You need to clearly identify the key areas for improvement that you are recommending. These should be limited to 3. More on that when we talk about the marking scheme a little bit later on. You need to be able to state the measurable impact that it's likely to have on the performance of the company as a whole, not only in terms of losses, but also potential improvements and gains. When it comes to a persuasive argument, always remember, in the arsenal of the safety professional, we can always base arguments on the moral background, the ethical position of health and safety, not to let people get injured. We can back that up also with the legal driving force and the punitive measures which are likely to be in place if we don't have compliance. And finally, putting together a good, strong financial argument going forwards. NEBOSH also specify for this one-page document, maximum font size should be Arial or equivalent 11 points, and your margin widths for top and bottom and left and right should be no greater than 2 centimetres. Turning our attention to the introduction. At the start of the introduction, you're expected to put in there aim and objectives. Now, the aim and the objectives of the assignment itself shouldn't be taken lightly. Although they do not actually attract any marks in the introduction section, they will attract marks when it comes to your conclusions. Fundamentally, the aim and the objectives is rather like the broadcast headlines on the news at 10, for example. These are the things that we're going to announce. These are the things that we're going to intend to cover through the structure of the report itself. So what we need is a clear, properly and well-defined overall aim for the structure of the assignment. And then within that, we need very, very specific and measurable objectives that we're going to try and achieve as we build upon this. And these will then be reviewed in the conclusion section, rather to the extent where we're going to look at how well we've met each objective, how well, or maybe in some cases, maybe failed to meet the objective fully. Now, so far as the aim is concerned, if you actually get a copy of the guidance itself, and this guidance has been reproduced on this slide, it will actually tell you what the overall aim of your actual report is. And that is, to quote, to carry out a review of the arrangements for managing health and safety in a workplace and to produce justified, proportionate recommendations to improve health and safety performance. It's a perfectly good aim. You might perhaps want to take the essence of that aim and put it into your own words, for example. The second part of the introduction we're going to consider now is to do with your methodology. What is absolutely essential to achieve good marks in this assignment is to be able to show that you've put time and effort in to gathering information from various sources. Remember from the course, whenever we looked at accident investigation, whenever we looked at auditing of company and so on, the sources that you're going to draw from will be threefold. Simply, number one, talking to people, interviewing people, draw up questionnaires, for example, and then you will be gathering data which will be available to analyse. You could do an analysis of documents. You could perhaps do a simple check on risk assessments, perhaps to see how many risk assessments are actually current, how many of them are within their review date. The other token is you can actually go and watch what happens, and this would be very, very useful for the data that you collect with respect to your analysis or commentary on your risk profile as a business, looking at specific hazards and the way in which they're controlled. In any case, they want to see, to achieve good marks, they want to see some evidence that you've put some time and effort in. Ultimately then, you will also not only take that data in, but you'll also maybe do some number crunching or some other form of critical analysis. And by critical analysis, what we basically mean is look at the data you've got, look at the actual standards which show what good performance might be, and evaluate what you've got in that respect. You know, from all sorts of dimensions. I mean, we're looking, remember, going forward to the main body. In your main body, you'll be looking at things like leadership, management, worker involvement, etc. In each of those areas, there is information that you can gather, and then it needs to be outputted in a suitable way. You could, for example, put it together in a comparative tabular array. You know, this is the standard, this is what we've got. Have we met it, for example? We could use graphs, graphical illustrations. We could perhaps suggest some trends if we're doing a longitudinal analysis. We could produce spreadsheets and so on. One hint of caution, though, however, don't just reproduce your data set and use it to pad out your main body. It's not going to attract any marks. If anything, only put it in if it's absolutely necessary in an appendix elsewhere. Otherwise, just don't include it whatsoever. The third part of your introduction gives you an opportunity to talk about the structure of the organisation and a description of the organisation as a whole. Within this, the areas that you've got to cover will be the general size of the organisation itself, the nature of the work that's carried out there, along with any specific processes of importance, the employment profile and the characteristics of the workforce, the size of the workforce, the spread of the workforce, the age of the workforce, and so on. The patterns of work which are undertaken, remembering things like shift patterns, etc., and or production schedules if we're looking at throughput and output. If your organisation is large and you've just chosen a small section of it, like a department or an individual site, make sure you clearly state what the relationship of that department or individual site is to the work of the organisation as a whole. And from the point of view of current arrangements for competent health and safety advice, obviously this in most cases will be your good selves or yourself working as a part of a team. However, I might stress that it is in keeping with good report writing. You should always do this in the third person. So don't refer to yourself as I or me, for example. Describe yourself as if it was someone else describing you. And just to reiterate, ensure you don't use your own name in this report. The final element that you need to describe within your introduction will give reference to the health and safety practitioner within the organisation, or really speaking any organisation as a whole, without again personalising this. So, for example, the role of the safety practitioner in enabling the organisation to set health and safety objectives, and how those, the assistance that you might give in terms of achievement of those things. Inevitably, there are likely to be potential ethical conflicts or other kind of like conflicts, for example, during the management of change and so on. And the challenges this brings to the role, because, in one respect, you're employed by your employer and you therefore have a duty to your employer. At the same token, you also have a duty to ensure that employees are kept safe. You also have a duty that third parties' activities are controlled from one respect, but also that third parties are kept safe, whether they're workers or members of the public, etc. Now, give some kind of descriptive or explanation as to what this context of ethics actually means in terms of honesty, respect, and integrity. I might suggest a good starting point for this is if you go to the IOSH website and you download a copy, and you might already have a copy, who knows, a copy of the IOSH Code of Conduct, because there is quite a lot in there in terms of what is considered appropriate ethical behaviour for its membership. Moving now on to the main body, the review and critical analysis of arrangements for the management of health and safety. The following areas will all attract marks: leadership, management, worker involvement, competence, compliance, and risk profile. And this is really where your methodology comes into its own. This is where we really need to see evidence that you've gone in and you've looked at your documents, you've seen what's been happening, you've talked to people, you've maybe constructed questionnaires and raised some data amongst the entire workforce from top to bottom. And the sort of areas that you might want to consider in each of these are as follows. So as far as leadership is concerned, you want to be able to say, these are suggestions, these are not written in stone, these are merely things which are proposed by NEBOSH as being areas you might want to consider. Is health and safety visible at board level and elsewhere within the structure? All the leaders within the organisation are not necessarily all going to be senior managers. You can get managers at all levels, or even individual employees who have leadership qualities, can inspire and motivate, as it were. But is it visible at board level and elsewhere? At board level, is there a declared and active champion for health and safety? What kind of visible behavioural examples do your business leaders demonstrate, if any? What is their general awareness of health and safety within the organisation of your choice? What is their awareness, for example, of what their duties and roles and accountabilities are? When a business decision is being made, is there always a consideration of the impacts on health and safety? And when an issue is raised with respect to health and safety, would you be able to determine whether or not the board is actually responsive to those issues? Moving on to management, a few key points for management. Health and safety is essentially a management function, as we're probably aware. The legal structure and also for international students, the convention structures are all based upon the accountability within the management structure for the responsibilities allocated. Is it a normal part of the manager's everyday management function within the role that they undertake at work? Do they have clear roles and responsibilities, and are those known? You might, for example, want to have a look at your safety policy and see whether or not you can determine what those roles and responsibilities are and question individual managers on those. Do they undertake performance monitoring with respect to the standards which are set within the workplace, with respect to how things are controlled, for example? Do they seek competent advice where it is needed? And do they understand that they have access to competent advice within the organisation? The information which is going to be important for them to make decisions, at local levels with respect to risk assessment, how things are controlled. Are they aware of the information which is there? Have they got availability of that information, for example? What role do management play in the control of third parties? Worst case scenario, do they just let them get on with it unchallenged? Or do they play an active role in the selection and or ongoing maintenance of contract or third party activities? Regarding worker involvement, consultation is a major part of health and safety with respect to, shall we say, getting better compliance out of the workforce as a whole. So what arrangements do your organisation make with respect to formal consultation opportunities? And are they effective? For example, if there is a safety committee that's been set up for that purpose, is it properly attended? Is it run with certain good practice rules in place? Agendas published in good time for consideration? Are the needs of vulnerable workers considered? For example, on notification of pregnancy, is the organisation equipped to provide pregnant worker risk assessments? Are the needs of persons with disabilities being met in the workplace? The timing of consultation is also a crucial episode. Is it in your organisation, assuming that it happens at all, is it more of a knee-jerk response, as and when needs arise, so more kind of like reactive? Or are we more proactive in our stance? Do we think more in terms of long term so that the consultative process can be allowed to be given some consideration amongst the workforce itself? If safety reps or representatives of employee safety are utilised within your organisation, are they given sufficient time and sufficient facilities to be able to effectively carry out their roles? Moving on to competence. Competency, again, is one of the main cornerstones of good health and safety arrangements and management within the workplace. Are your managers and supervisors competent enough to be effective in discharging their health and safety responsibilities? Who is the competent person and are they effective? And remember, again, we should be talking here in terms of third party. When given advice by a competent person, does the organisation act on it? at least contemplate and consider the advice that's being given before they make a decision. Is there any lack? Is there a lack of competency in any particular area within the organisation? Skills, for example, and/or knowledge. Think about the selection practices of workers. What criteria is used for the selection of workers, and does health and safety form a part of that? Are workers themselves, as well as managers mentioned recently, aware of their own health and safety roles and responsibilities outlined within the policy, outlined within the national framework of compliances? How do you go about in your organisation identifying whether or not people's training needs have been fully identified for them to be met? Is this an active process or is it a reactive process? In other words, we find out that a person was not competent from an accident investigation. It would be much better where we're going forward, where, for example, change is being brought about, that we identify our training needs as a must before change is then implemented. What about contractors? What arrangements do you have in place where we need to have more specific control over their activities when they are performing our undertaking for us? What arrangements do we have to ensure that they are fully competent to undertake that? And at the very least, when they're being brought into the organisation for the first time, is there an induction training session? And then, is that effective? Is it done in good time? Also, with respect to some specific key roles with respect to health and safety, and we're thinking here about any role, this could be, for example, for first aid and first aid provision. Are there arrangements made for things like leave and absence of those individual key workers, such as first aiders? Compliance is another area which attracts marks. And from this point of view, you might want to consider what sets the standards for compliance within your organisation, and how are we meeting these with respect to local, national laws, International Labour Organisation conventions, with respect to the International Diploma, any approved codes of practice, any guidance, whether that be from our regulators or the guidance coming from industry standards, for example. What level of compliance do we have within our safety management system structures? It will have a set of targets and objectives to be met, and how good are we at meeting those targets? And over and above that, we may have our own internal standards in any case. Internal standards, perhaps in some cases, which go beyond the regulatory framework. Insurers may themselves set specific standards for particular types of risk that we undertake within our organisation, process risks and so on, and how these are set and how well we are compliant with them. And finally, considering all cases, how does the organisation actually demonstrate its compliance? Think on the basic question. If a case came to a court of law and the barrister asks the question, how can you demonstrate your compliance? You're going to need to have an answer. So you might want to dwell on that. Out of these particular 6 areas, it's the risk profile section which attracts the most marks. Therefore, this is one of the areas amongst the 6 you might want to give the majority of your consideration to. And consider the following. What is the nature of the significant risks that your organisation faces in terms of your activities, your arrangements, if you like, section going forwards within your policy might be a good place to start. For any particular adverse risks, emergencies and so on, are they catered for with respect to things like major disruption and contingency planning? Is health and safety integrated, or the risk profile that health and safety brings integrated into your other management and business considerations? Is it considered amongst all other decisions? Have your critical risks all been identified and appropriately assessed? Critical controls, hand in hand with that, are they in place? Have they been properly implemented? Your methods for assessing risk, are they proportionate? Are they sensible? Are they indeed suitable and sufficient? That also goes in terms of our risk assessments themselves. Could you describe those as suitable and sufficient? Does the organisation undertake suitable measuring activities, both active measuring and reactive measuring? And from the data which is provided by those active and reactive measures, are there effective and suitable reviews which take place? And coming back to our board level again, is this conducted at board level? What is the role of the health and safety practitioner within your organisation with respect to the advice and organisation ability with respect to declaring the risk profile of the organisation also? First item on your marking scheme is focus and presentation. There are 5 marks available for this, and you can think of these as 5 marks that you could lose rather than gain. So you will lose marks if you fail to ensure that there is a clear ethical basis to your report. You will also lose a mark if the information that you presented is not clearly given. If you deviate from the prescribed structure, as mentioned earlier on in this video, you are also likely to lose marks. If you fail to use the recognised academic standard for referencing and bibliography, you can lose a mark. And also if your executive summary goes over more than 1 page for the font size and margin spacings given. Your executive summary is worth 10 marks. Remember, this is a 1-pager which should contain a summary of your conclusions and recommendations. You should have made a convincing case for the resolution and improvement of your problems. It should be based upon moral, legal and financial persuasive arguments. It should also have a measurable indication of the impact that it's likely to have on the organisation and the business performance. It should be written in a way that captures the reader's attention. So it needs to be pretty snappy and pithy. And also the recommendations that you're going to be made for solving your problems should be both reasonable and proportionate. Your introduction section is worth 5 marks. Your aim and objectives should be clearly stated. You should give an adequate description of your methodology that you've used. You should have been able to describe your chosen workplace for the criteria as previously given. Identify the role of the safety practitioner within that organisation, and also reference to the meaning and application, in this case, of ethical principles. Turning to the main body of the report, the review and critical analysis, this is where the major amount of the marks are going to be available. There are 70 marks in total, and these are made up as following. Firstly, 5 marks each for each section on leadership, management, worker involvement, competence and compliance. And for each of those individual sections, you should be able to show that you have demonstrated detailed and clear understanding, that the information that you're providing is relevant and it's been evidenced. There is comprehensive coverage of the situation as a whole. There is a relationship between information that you've gathered and the evidence that you have based that information on, and that is clearly shown. The review that you undertake on the information that you've brought forward has been rigorous. The evidence has been analysed against some form of recognised standard. So, for example, looking at your risk profile, which comes up a little later, this could be against, guidance notes, approved codes of practice, etc. That the current standards in place have been critically evaluated against best practice. That there is demonstration of both research by yourself and critical analysis skills used, and also there should be reference to what constitutes good practice in all relevant areas. Within those 70 marks for the review and critical analysis, your written piece on risk profile is itself worth 15 marks. And to achieve those 15 marks, you have to include a demonstration of clear and accurate understanding in appropriate detail, that the information that you provide is both relevant and has been evidenced. There is a relationship that is clear between the information and evidence that you're providing. Again, based upon rigorous inquiry. Evidence has been analysed against some kind of relevant standard, as mentioned before, approved codes of practice, guidance notes, legislative standards, and so on. The evidence has been critically analysed, and there is a demonstration of both research and critical analysis skills. The second part of the main body is the evaluation of the improvements which are required. This is worth 30 marks in total. Each improvement of the 3 is worth 10 marks. Your content for each of those improvements is going to be determined on the following. The improvement that you've selected is appropriate and has been justified in terms of priority. At least one opportunity for the improvement is given. Now, I read this as benefit of the improvement itself. What is the benefit or the opportunity for the organisation? And also how the improvement is going to be achieved. And that needs to be an explanation, as mentioned previously, on points for the main body, and the structure of your answers, allocation of responsibilities, provision of internal and external resources, identification of training requirements, allocation of appropriate and realistic timescales, and also the mechanisms whereby the effectiveness of the improvements are going to be measured and monitored. You should also, for each of your improvements, include a simple cost-benefit analysis as outlined earlier on. The final item on the marking scheme is your conclusions and recommendations, which is worth 10 marks. To gain those 10 marks, you will have to ensure that your aim, objectives and scope have been referenced, how well they've been achieved or met. There should be a concise summary of the main findings of the report itself. There should be no new factors included in this. You will lose marks if you start talking about new issues but not included them in the main body. The recommendations you're making have been justified. And finally, there is a convincing argument in place for the implementation of your 3 improvements.